Hello everybody! Today we've got another slightly different video for the channel. I wanted to dig into one of my favorite comic book limited series and do a sort of critical analysis of it and talk to you about the themes that I've extrapolated from it and the kind of cultural ripple effect it might have had. Please keep in mind though, I am not truly an academic and this is just a collection of thoughts and opinions from one doo-doo-brained man who's far too obsessed with the X-Men. With all that being said, let's get into the analysis for Storm and Illyana, Magik, a 4-issue limited series. Some quick backstory on Illyana so we can better contextualize the story we're about to take a look at. I think Illyana has one of the most tragic and heartbreaking stories in all of X-Men comics. I mean, it's not a trauma competition, but if it was, she'd be a top contender. Illyana is the younger sister of Colossus, and part of the sadness of the events that are about to unfold is Colossus was worried if Illyana stayed in Russia, she'd be forced eventually to become a weapon of the government if it turned out she had mutant powers that would potentially manifest themselves, which they did later on, of course, as we know. So she ends up staying in the United States with him, and to make a long story short, that blonde little Russian 6-year-old ends up getting kidnapped by Belasco and ends up trapped in Limbo, a dark dimension of Belasco's domain. Now, for the X-Men, they totally failed to save this 6-year-old Illyana from getting stuck in Limbo, but to them, she was only gone for seconds, and she immediately popped right back. But for her, it was half her life, and so when she comes back, she is age 14 now. So she literally grew up in a blink of their eyes. This miniseries covers what happened in Limbo, and is sort of like an anti-coming-of-age story for Magik, really. It's about the theft of her youth and, what should have been the most carefree and joyful years of her life. And it's about corruption of innocence, but, also the perseverance of a truly good heart in the face of all that. And as I always say when this story comes up, it is metal as hell. It's very awesome, and there's very hardcore things in it, and it's an exciting read that I would recommend to anybody, and it's part of the reason I'm making this video. So the stage is set. We are ready to dive into the trials of Illyana's formative years. So first, let's take a look at our cast, who may look like familiar faces, but aren't quite so. We should of course start off with our main character, Illyana, who we've talked about already. She's the one who goes through the central change in this story. She's the one who's forced to grow up, and that change she goes through is a lot of development for her character and throws her in the thick of it with adversity. But what it also does is it potentially plants seeds for her path to deviate to a darker one down the line in the future. And that's the kind of reason I feel it could be both qualified as a coming-of-age story and an anti-coming-of-age story, because she does go from childish to very mature by the end of this, which is typical of coming-of-age, and she does learn some hard lessons, but it also makes her a lot more cynical, and it harms her outlook on the world. And also, the skills the protagonist of a coming-of-age story gets should ideally help them as a member of a functioning society, but when Illyana gets back, she feels anything but that. She's unfamiliar with our world, and she feels like an outsider trapped between two spaces. So that part of her metamorphosis isn't fully completed and is explored further in New Mutants when she joins that team, actually. And now for the other character whose name is in the title of the miniseries, Ororo, or Storm as we know her. Now, this is a different version of the character that we were first introduced to, actually, when the X-Men first departed into Limbo in Uncanny X-Men issue 160. Basically, to simplify things with Limbo and the alternate X-Men that are there's a group of X-Men that are hanging around Limbo still in this, and they are the X-Men who visited Limbo but were unable to make it back to their home dimension. So they're condemned to Limbo, and each has their own either darker path, crueler fate, or more morally gray path that they end up following. And this version of Storm had become a sorceress apprentice to Belasco. Now in her history, she turned against Belasco and ended up in this eternal battle with him and the demons of Limbo. So she's a very cool but hardened, powerful sorceress who's surviving Limbo, and by the time we meet her in this story, she's also a much older, maybe wiser version of Storm. So she acts as this mentor and sort of world introduction and explainer to Illyana when she first gets stuck in Limbo, because she starts to teach Illyana how to use some of the dark magic that is now intertwined into her soul thanks to Belasco turning part of Illyana's soul into a bloodstone, which gives him some control over her, but also gives her, some innate power within. So she's interesting because basically what's happening with Illyana and Belasco is kind of a version of what happened with this Storm and Belasco. So she's seeing that parallel and doing what she can to help Illyana succeed here and, make sure that they don't end up on the same path together. And it does work. Their paths end up splitting and they go in their own different directions, but we'll get into that later, actually. I think that's part of the reason they chose to make her a much older version of Storm too, to play off the whole youth being stolen element and showcase how Illyana could potentially end up in an old, bitter, maybe even evil version of herself in Limbo 2. Next up, we've got our alternate version of Kitty Pryde, who is called Cat here. If we want to examine things through the sort of traditional hero's journey, both Storm and Cat here are kind of the helper, or perhaps you could say that Storm is the threshold guardian, wanting to sort of shelter Illyana in her own sanctuary while she teaches her magic, and then Cat is the true, more traditional helper and or mentor here. But they work in tandem, and, throughout this series, Illyana gets a little something from everyone. Now, Storm gives her the foundational knowledge of magic training, and then Cat acts as this also very hardened and disillusioned version of her original Earth 616 self and teaches Illyana swordsmanship, combat, and strength training. And of course, she also includes some personal thoughts about her ideologies and perseverance in here that Illyana may or may not absorb a bit of. With Cat, we again here are tapping into a central theme of the series, which is that corruption and loss of youth. Kitty or Cat is another example of how Limbo has taken all that away and what it threatens to poison Illyana with if she can't find her way back to her own home dimension. And the stakes of all this are incredibly high. I mean, the longer Illyana is there, the worse it's going to get. And then we have one of the sadder variants of a character, which is this version of Nightcrawler. Now, he's a bad man here and is working directly with Belasco. Nightcrawler is different though, or at least in my interpretation, compared to the other characters here, because he doesn't really outright represent a loss of youth to me, but it's even a bit darker than that. His is a true and utter corruption of his soul. I mean, knowing what we know about Nightcrawler in the main 616 Earth, he is a kind of devoutly religious character, big sweetheart. His morality and his principles are strongly based on his core belief system. But here, I mean, whatever trauma or whatever torment he's gone through or witnessed others go through in Limbo has completely washed all of that off of him. And he's no longer the friendly German elf we all knew and loved. He's truly a sort of devious, cunning, monstrous creation of Limbo now. And a very formidable opponent for Illyana. And then really the only other character worth mentioning is Belasco, who is our antagonist that kind of acts as a bookend to this limited series. Interestingly enough, the journey that Cat and Illyana go on leads them right to Belasco, and due to a series of events, this leads to Illyana sort of having this internal soul battle with herself, and she ends up giving in to being a student of Belasco. See, it's like I said, she picks up skills from literally everyone in this story. She is like the culmination of all these damn souls of Limbo by the end, essentially. Illyana kind of ends up trying to play Belasco by being a good student and trying to learn all she can so she can rebel against him one day, just like Storm did. But like I said, stakes are high here, and the longer she's there working under him, the more she begins to enjoy the evil powers, so she knows she has to destroy him quickly. Now Storm comes to her through astral projection and is like, no, do not do that. Just, look, you have so much to lose, Illyana. You don't want to risk it. Now, this next part I'm going to discuss and look at is basically the conclusion of the story. So, there will be spoilers in this part, sort of major spoilers for the story, some of the big, more shocking moments. So, if this is something you want to read first and experience firsthand for yourself, maybe bookmark the video, come back later, or if you've already read this, then you're good to go, or if you don't care about me spoiling it for you, you'll still be able to enjoy it either through this video or you'll be able to enjoy it with this video and then going to read it in retrospect. Either way, I just have to let you know I'm going to get into some spoiler territory. So going back a little, because I skipped over some things to avoid spoilers, I said Cat and Illyana end up at Belasco's place, which is true, but I left out the details of what happens next, and this is where evil Nightcrawler comes into play. Basically, Illyana's newly found sword skills are put to the test against Nightcrawler, who is kind of a master swordsman, and also has the ability to teleport, which Illyana doesn't yet, by the way. So it's a little unfair, and though Illyana ends up faring well for a bit, she does need to even the playing field, and then luckily gets help from Cat, who very epically phases through the floor, grabs Nightcrawler's ankle, and then phases him into the floor, shattering all those bones. It's insane. And then Kitty ends up stabbing Nightcrawler in the chest, killing him, which I can only assume she did, well, partially to eliminate a threat, but also to help Illyana at least preserve having not taken a life, and especially a life who is a mirror of someone she did know as a very nice person. She even says in this book, actually, how hard it was to see evil Nightcrawler die, just because the Nightcrawler she knew was so different and caring, and yeah, I imagine that would be weird, and you would have a lot of overwhelming, conflicting emotions seeing something like that, so it makes sense. But at this time, Belasco himself proves to be too powerful, and so he stops them, and he further transmorphs Cat into a more, well, cat-like creature, and that also affects her instincts. And so it seems this version of Cat, or Kitty Pryde, is now too far gone and too far corrupted. And so as we discussed, Illyana becomes a mentor to Belasco, while Cat roams around the house as this little animal servant, which is sad to see and probably very disheartening for Illyana to see one of her mentors of this world destroyed like that. Eventually, the sorceress Storm comes to try and rescue Illyana. This ends up not going so well as Cat, ordered to by Belasco, attacks Storm and mortally wounds her. And then Illyana is forced to face off against Animal Instinct Cat, which is another sad moment in the story, as not only was Kitty Pryde of the 616 universe her best friend, but this cat even taught her so much and taught her the hand-to-hand combat that Illyana actually uses to eventually snap Cat's neck. And she doesn't end up feeling much from this, and that causes some introspective questioning of the state of her soul. But I tend to think that deep down, the good part of her knew it was an act of mercy, truly, to not let Cat continue to be just a servant, little house pet of Belasco. To make matters worse, with now one dead mentor of Illyana, she has to kill another. Storm. The reason she does this is another act of mercy, actually, because Belasco is about to condemn Storm's soul instead of letting her pass on quietly and peacefully, so Illyana is forced to stab her to prevent that fate for Storm. This is also a very kind of beautifully heartbreaking moment where with Storm's death, there's one last lightning crackle in the sky that comes down and shatters Belasco's tower as Illyana escapes elsewhere to Limbo using her now manifested teleportation powers. And now Illyana is all alone, contemplating her existence, thinking about all of the X-Men and all the great souls who had come to this place before and had been corrupted one by one. But is she resigned to her fate? To die in Limbo, or worse, to be groomed as a future wife, queen, or whatever side thing of Limbo Belasco wants her to be? No, because Illyana's soul and heart are stronger than that. She goes back to the place where Storm taught her magic and summons her sword, a weapon of great power that is capable of defeating Belasco. It's sort of symbolic of how far she's come. And with the wealth of her knowledge from all of her mentors, Storm, Cat, and Belasco himself, now she's ready to go face him with her sword, her magic, and her mutant ability. And as she starts getting the upper hand in this battle, well, power corrupts, and she starts growing horns and devilish features as Belasco's fade away, representing him quickly losing his grip on the power of Limbo. But Illyana, realizing she can now kill Belasco, doesn't, because she knows that that would only lead to further corruption of her soul, and as stated, she's stronger than that, and she's better than that, and it was the right choice as her demon form then fades away. She spares Belasco, rejecting to become the person she hates, and he makes a break for it, a battle to continue another day. But in the meantime, having defeated him, she now becomes the throne holder for Limbo, the ruler of the domain, and finally, she uses her powers to return home to the 616 universe with the X-Men as she knew them. Okay, so key takeaways of this story. Well, no real happy ending here, folks. This experience has drastically altered Illyana's self-perception. She sees herself as a monster after all of this, an other that doesn't belong and isn't possibly worthy of belonging. And in life, you can't wash your hands and be clean of your trauma suddenly. But even further here, it is literally something that is part of Illyana's soul. I didn't touch on it as much in this video, but there's also definitely an analysis to be made about grooming in here in regards to Belasco to Illyana. A very strong and obvious argument, I think. We got to see many depictions early on in X-Men stories, and in this, via Storm's magic, how truly innocent Illyana was. And also, we got depicted very powerfully the enormity of the trauma Belasco was able to inflict on this young soul in such a short amount of time. Making this video and taking a much deeper look at the story, it's got enormous, long-lasting consequences that affect the core of Illyana's characterization, and it's very sad in a very guttural, heartbreaking way. As cool and as metal as the story is, like I mentioned before, it will absolutely rip your heart out, and we don't get much catharsis from it. But that's how comics work in a sense. This is a foundational story for the character, not the end. Maybe sometime in the future I'll get to talk about Inferno with you all, which sort of maybe completes this Illyana arc by restoring the childhood that was stolen from her. But until then, guys, you have a great day, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me ramble on about one of my favorite comic book miniseries in X-Men.